In late September of 1944, in a farmhouse headquarters in eastern France, a 40-year-old German staff officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin sat down to write an assessment of what had just happened to his army group at a place called Arracourt. He was a major general. He was the chief of the general staff for Army Group G, fighting in Lorraine under Hermann Bulk. He had served in Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, with Rommel in the desert, at Stalingrad, at Kursk, and now, finally, against the Americans on the Western Front. He had also just watched, over the course of 11 days, 2 brand-new German panzer brigades equipped with Panther tanks straight from the factory get torn apart by an American armored division that on paper had no business defeating them. The 4th Armored Division of the United States Army had lost tanks, plenty of tanks. By the end of the engagement, however, what unsettled Mellenthin and the staff officers around him was not the casualty figure. It was something stranger. American formations they had counted as combat ineffective were back in action within days. Tanks that had been hit, abandoned, and left smoking in Lorraine fields were reappearing in the line. The German order of battle estimates kept being wrong. The American units they were tracking would not stay degraded. Mellenthin would write about this experience in his post-war memoir Panzer Battles, published in 1956, and read ever since by armor officers and historians on both sides of the Atlantic. He would describe American material wealth, American air superiority, American artillery, and American operational caution. But the question that ran through his account, and through the post-war interviews his fellow generals gave to American interrogators in the years that followed, was not really about any of those things. It was about something the Germans, with all their doctrinal precision and engineering pride, did not have a clean word for. Their tanks died and stayed dead. The Americans' tanks died and came back. The Wehrmacht in 1944 had a tank, the Panzer V Panther, that on paper was the most advanced medium tank in the world. Its frontal armour could not be defeated by a Sherman 75mm gun at any reasonable range. Its long-barreled high-velocity gun could destroy a Sherman from beyond 1,000 yards. By every measure of engineering excellence, the Panther was the better machine. And yet, by the autumn of 1944, German tank commanders all along the Western Front, in their after-action reports and their later memoirs, were describing the same phenomenon Mellenthin saw at Arracourt. American Sherman units would lose vehicles during the day and field nearly the same number again days later. The Germans could not, in their own categories of replacement and reinforcement, account for it. The senior German officers who survived the war and were brought to converted manor houses at Allendorf, Neustadt, and Bad Mondorf in 1945 and afterward, where the United States Army's Historical Division ran its Foreign Military Studies program, were asked to write what they had observed. More than 2,000 manuscripts came out of that program. The studies are sometimes self-serving. They are sometimes evasive on uncomfortable questions. But on the matter of why German armour lost battles it expected to win, they were oddly direct, and the answer they kept circling back to was not one Hitler could have given, and not one their own engineers could have predicted. To understand it, we have to go back not to Normandy, not to 1942, not even to the start of the European War. We need to go back to a Washington meeting in the summer of 1940, and to a Danish-born automobile executive named William Knudsen, who was about to make a series of decisions that would, almost 3 decades later, decide what was happening on the roads of Lorraine. This is the story of how the United States Army turned the Sherman tank, an admittedly inferior machine, into a superior weapon by building a system of recovery and repair that the Germans never matched, never seriously tried to match, and could only watch with something approaching disbelief. To begin, we have to start with a fact that should sound counterintuitive. The American advantage in armoured warfare in the Second World War did not come from tank design. It came from automobile manufacturing. In June of 1940, with France collapsing and the United States still officially neutral, the American Ordnance Department had a problem. The country needed to mass-produce tanks, and it had no real industrial base for doing it. The Army had been quietly contracting with locomotive manufacturers, the American Locomotive Company, the Baldwin Locomotive Works, and the Lima Locomotive Works, on the theory that anyone who could build a steam engine could build a tank. The locomotive companies were good at heavy castings. They were not good at producing thousands of identical machines on tight schedules because they had never had to. By the summer of 1940, it was clear they could not meet the volume the War Department was projecting. That is when William Knudsen, then president of General Motors, walked into a Washington meeting and made a simple argument. Tanks, he said, were not locomotives. Tanks were vehicles. The people who knew how to build vehicles in volume, on standardized production lines, with interchangeable parts and predictable quality, were the people who built automobiles. He suggested that the army stop thinking like a railroad and start thinking like Detroit. Knudsen was named to the National Defense Advisory Commission and given responsibility for industrial production for the war effort. In January of 1942, he was commissioned a lieutenant general in the United States Army, the only civilian ever to enter the army at that rank. One of his first calls about tanks went to K.T. Keller, the president of Chrysler. Keller's answer, on the 7th of June 1940, was that Chrysler could build a tank factory from scratch on a vacant lot. Ground was broken in September on a roughly $20 million plant contract on what had been a vacant tract north of Detroit. Approximately 7.5 months later, on the 27th of April 1941, the first tank rolled off the line. The Detroit tank arsenal would eventually produce roughly 22,000 tanks during the war and would become known, with reason, as the Arsenal of Democracy. Detroit was only one piece of the production network. Sherman tanks were eventually built across 11 different facilities, including the Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, the Pressed Steel Car Company at its plant in Joliet, Illinois, the Pacific Car and Foundry in Renton, Washington, the Pullman Standard Car Manufacturing Company, the Federal Machine and Welder Company, the Fisher Tank Arsenal at Grand Blanc, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company, the American Locomotive Company at Schenectady, the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Pennsylvania, and the Detroit Arsenal itself. Different plants used different engines. The M4 used a Continental radial. The M4A1 used the same. The M4A2 used a twin General Motors diesel. The M4A3 used a Ford GAA gasoline V8. The M4A4 used a Chrysler Multibank, 5 inline 6-passenger car engines bolted around a common crankshaft and bull gear. On its face, this looked like a logistical nightmare. In some respects, it was. But the underlying components, the running gear, the suspension, the tracks, the turret rings, the basic geometry of the hull, were standardized across all variants. By the end of the war, the United States would produce roughly 49,000 Shermans, more than the entire German tank output of the war by a wide margin. But the volume is not the part of the story that matters most. The part that matters most is what came with the volume, because when you ask Detroit to build a tank, Detroit does not give you a Tiger. Detroit gives you something that looks, philosophically, like a Ford pickup truck. The Ordnance Department designers who finalized the Sherman in 1941 made a series of choices that, when read today, look almost strange. They prioritized standardization of components over engineering perfection. They prioritized ease of production over armor thickness. They prioritized maintainability in the field over invulnerability in combat. They wanted a tank that an average American mechanic, the kind of man who had spent his adolescence taking apart Ford Model A engines on a farm in Ohio, could service with a wrench, a torch, and a manual. A Sherman engine, depending on the variant, could be removed and replaced in roughly 1 to 2 days by a properly equipped maintenance crew in the field. The transmission could be swapped through the front of the hull, which had been deliberately designed with bolted access panels for that purpose. The tracks could be repaired with hand tools. The road wheels were bolted, not welded. Every major subsystem was designed on the assumption that it would, at some point, be damaged, and that the men who needed to fix it would be doing the work in the rain, in the mud, in a French farm field, by lantern light. This was not how the German tank industry thought. The German automotive tradition tilted toward precision engineering. The men who designed the Panther, MAN and Daimler-Benz were trained in a culture that treated a tank like an exquisite mechanism. The Panther had a complicated double-radius steering system, a sophisticated torsion bar suspension with overlapping road wheels, and a final drive assembly that, in early production, used double spur gears with substandard steel because the proper helical gears would have slowed production further. The result, particularly in the early Aus D and Aus V models, was a tank with magnificent firepower and frontal armor that could, and did, regularly destroy itself on a road march. Operational availability rates for the Panther across 1944 ran roughly 50 to 60% on average. The final drive units, the components that connected the engine's power to the tracks, had a documented life expectancy under stress of around 150 kilometers, a figure later confirmed by the post-war French army evaluation when France inherited Panthers in 1947 and pressed them into peacetime service. By January of 1945, after the Ardennes offensive, a status report on the Panthers committed to that operation showed that of 282 tanks still in unit possession, only 97 were operational. 198 had been written off entirely. The Sherman, by contrast, had a mechanical reliability rate that German tankers, when they captured intact examples, found almost embarrassing. Captured Shermans were used by the Wehrmacht as armoured recovery vehicles because, with the turret removed, the Sherman's powertrain was simply more dependable than anything the German factories were producing for that role. This is the first piece of the puzzle. The Americans had not built a better tank than the Germans. They had built a tank that a farm boy from Iowa could keep running, and that turned out to matter more than armour thickness. But a serviceable design is only part of the answer. A wrench in a barn does not repair a tank that is sitting on a battlefield 20 miles from the nearest workshop, with German artillery walking shells across the field. To understand the second part of the answer, we have to look at what the United States Army built around the Sherman, not the doctrine, not the tactics, but the unglamorous, underwritten, and almost entirely uncelebrated machinery of recovery and repair. For that, we turn to a young lieutenant in the maintenance battalion of the 3rd Armoured Division, sitting in a half-flooded foxhole somewhere in eastern Belgium in late 1944, writing tank loss reports by candlelight. The man's name was Belton Youngblood Cooper. He was born in October of 1917 and grew up in Alabama. He had attended the Virginia Military Institute, transferred to the University of Michigan to study marine architecture and engineering, and been swept by bureaucratic accident into the Army's Ordnance branch in June of 1941. He was assigned to the 3rd Armored Division, one of only 2 American heavy armored divisions of the war, and he served as an Ordnance Liaison Officer with Combat Command B from Normandy to the surrender of Germany. Cooper's job was to keep track of which tanks had been knocked out, recover them where possible, and ensure replacements arrived. He spent the war driving a jeep through what he called the void, the gap of anywhere from a few miles to 50 miles between the front lines and the supply trains, carrying loss reports too sensitive to send by radio. He was wounded more than once. He survived the war and lived into his 90th year. In 1998, more than half a century after the events, Cooper published a memoir called Death Traps. The book is controversial among armour historians, and parts of its argument about the Pershing tank have been disputed by scholars including Stephen Zaloga, whose work Armoured Thunderbolt has offered a more conservative reckoning of American tank losses. But Cooper's central record of what he saw in the maintenance battalion has held up. By his own count, the 3rd Armoured Division entered combat in Normandy, with 232 operational Sherman tanks. Over the course of the European campaign, the division had 648 Shermans completely destroyed in combat. It had another 700 Shermans knocked out, recovered, repaired, and returned to operation. The total count of Shermans put out of action in that one division was 1,348, against an initial strength of 232. Cooper called it a loss rate of 580%. Zaloga and other historians have cautioned that some of those second-category losses were lighter damage than full knockouts, but even on the most conservative reading of the numbers, the central fact stands. Of every Sherman knocked out by enemy action in the 3rd Armoured Division, a very large proportion came back, not in the abstract, not as donated steel, as running, fighting, crewed tanks back in the line, sometimes within 48 hours of having been hit. This is what the German tankers along the Western Front kept seeing and could not put into a category. They were not seeing reinforcement, in the sense they understood it, where new tanks arrived from a depot. They were seeing resurrection. They were seeing what looked, to anyone watching across a Lorraine field, like the same tanks coming back at them after they had every reason to believe those tanks were finished. And the men responsible for it were not, by any standard the Germans recognized, front-line soldiers. They were ordnance men. They were maintenance battalion mechanics. They were people Cooper himself, in his book, called the men in the wrenches. The system Cooper served in was extraordinarily layered. At the company level, every American tank battalion had its own maintenance section, equipped with an M32 tank recovery vehicle. The M32 was a Sherman with the turret removed and replaced with a fixed superstructure, an A-frame boom, and a 60,000-pound winch. It could drive onto the battlefield, hook up a damaged Sherman, and tow it back under its own power. It carried welding equipment, cutting torches, and a small inventory of common spare parts. Its crew typically included a recovery sergeant who in civilian life had often been an automotive mechanic or a heavy equipment operator. Its job was to go forward, sometimes under fire, and bring back what could be brought back. Above that level, every armoured division had a dedicated ordnance maintenance battalion. These battalions ran what were called vehicle collecting points, or VCPs, behind the front lines. The first VCP for the 3rd Armoured Division's Combat Command B was set up near Arles, France, in mid-June of 1944, only days after the division landed in Normandy. The 33rd Maintenance Battalion's recovery crews began bringing in damaged vehicles within hours. As wrecks arrived, maintenance crews had to crawl inside and clean out the remains of the men who had been killed in them. Blood, gore, identifications passed to graves registration before any repair work could begin. They used industrial detergents and disinfectants to make the interiors workable. Then the welders and the mechanics took over. The work was organized into categories the Army called echelons of maintenance. First echelon was crew-level work, the routine cleaning and tightening any tank crew did between engagements. Second echelon was the company maintenance section. Third echelon was the divisional ordnance battalion at a vehicle collecting point. Fourth echelon was Army or Corps-level repair, often handled in semi-permanent rear installations. Fifth echelon was full rebuild, conducted at facilities deep in the rear. Damage to a tank moved up the echelons depending on what was needed. A damaged track and a knocked-out radio might be fixed at the company level in an hour. A penetrated hull and a dead engine might travel back through 3 echelons over the course of 3 days. A burnt-out wreck with a cracked engine block might be sent all the way to a depot in England or back across the Atlantic to be cannibalized for parts. A radial engine could be pulled from a Sherman and replaced with a new one in under a day. A damaged transmission could be swapped through the front hull. Tracks were re-welded or re-linked. Holes in the armor were patched with steel plate cut on the spot from whatever was available, sometimes from the wrecks of other tanks, sometimes from German anti-invasion obstacles salvaged from the beaches. In one well-known photograph from August of 1944, taken at a repair depot near Le Tailleux in France, a maintenance crew can be seen using a heavy wrecker to drop a fresh radial engine into a 2nd Armored Division Sherman named Hurricane. The photograph captures the basic posture of American tank maintenance throughout the campaign: men in coveralls with grease on their hands, a heavy wrecker, a tank with its engine deck open, and the front lines audible somewhere in the middle distance. Above the divisional level, there were Army-level maintenance facilities, ordnance battalions assigned to corps and field armies that handled deeper repairs. And above those, in Belgium, England, and eventually in liberated French and Belgian factories, there were full rebuild facilities that could take a Sherman that had been pulled out of a hedgerow with its turret blown off and turn it back into a combat-ready vehicle in a matter of weeks. A German Panther, by contrast, in 1944, was effectively impossible to repair properly outside of a major rear area depot. The final drive assemblies that failed so often required factory-level work. There were too few Berger Panther recovery vehicles. The German maintenance system, which had been adequate for the simpler Panzer IIIs and IVs of the early war years, had not been scaled to the complexity of the late war machines. Hans von Luck, who served with the 21st Panzer Division in Normandy and on the Eastern Front and later wrote the memoir Panzer Commander, described in detail how fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and Allied air interdiction were eroding German armoured strength outside of any direct armour-on-armour combat at all. The Americans, meanwhile, had built a machine for keeping tanks alive. Now, the obvious question: where did this come from? Because the United States Army of 1939 had been a small, sleepy peacetime force with no particular tradition of armoured warfare and no special doctrine of recovery and repair. By 1944, it had built the most effective tank maintenance system the world had ever seen. How? The answer is the same as the deeper answer to a great many questions about American performance in the Second World War. It came not from the army, but from American civilian society. It came from the fact that the men who staffed those ordnance maintenance battalions had grown up, in their thousands, in a country where keeping a vehicle running was a normal human skill. By the late 1930s, the United States had a higher rate of automobile ownership than any other country on Earth, roughly 10 times the rate of Nazi Germany. A whole generation of American men had reached adulthood already, knowing how to change a tire, swap a head gasket, time a distributor, and rebuild a carburetor on a kitchen table. Rural America was particularly saturated with this knowledge. Farm boys ran tractors, trucks, and combines that they could not afford to send to a dealer for repair, so they fixed them themselves with whatever was lying in the barn. Urban mechanics had the experience of high-volume garage work, where a Model T or a Model A came in every 20 minutes. When the Army inducted these men in 1942 and 1943, it did not have to teach them how to think about machines. They already thought about machines correctly. They thought about them as combinations of subsystems that could be diagnosed, removed, replaced, and bench-tested. The Army needed only to give them tools, parts, and a doctrinal framework for doing the same work in uniform that they had been doing in civilian life, which it did. Curtis Cullen, a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron operating with the 2nd Armoured Division, who in July of 1944 invented the Rhino device that allowed Shermans to cut through the Normandy hedgerows, was a sales promotion assistant at Schenley Industries, a liquor distributor, before the war. He had grown up in Cranford, New Jersey. Lafayette Poole, who became the highest-scoring American tank commander of the European theatre, while serving with the 3rd Armoured Division at Mons and in the fighting near Liège in September of 1944, had been raised on a Texas farm and trained as an engineer. The men in the maintenance battalions had similar backgrounds. They were not exotic. They were the average. They were, in essence, the American 20th century, with a wrench in one hand and an army manual in the other. The Germans had no equivalent. German society of the 1930s was, by comparison, under-motorized. There were far fewer cars per capita. The automotive industry that did exist tilted toward luxury and engineering precision rather than mass consumption. A German farm boy in 1940 was far less likely to have spent his teenage years rebuilding a vehicle than his American counterpart. When the Wehrmacht expanded in the late 1930s, it could draft excellent draftsmen, machinists, and engineers, but it could not draft an entire population of casual mechanics because that population did not exist in the same density. The German maintenance system reflected the difference. This raises a deeper question. If German engineering was so refined, if the Panther was such a magnificent design, why did the maintenance disparity matter so much? Surely a tank as powerful as a Panther, even at half availability, could outfight a Sherman at near full availability. Why did the math not work in the German favour? The answer is that by 1944 the math had stopped working in nearly every direction at once. And the place where it became clearest is a small French farming town named Arracourt, where in September of that year, a battle was fought that stripped the comfortable myth of the unbeatable Panther down to its frame. Arracourt is not as famous as it should be. Between the 18th and the 29th of September, 1944, the United States 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A, supported by tank destroyer battalions, and the 19th Tactical Air Command, met two newly formed German panzer brigades, equipped with brand-new Panthers and Panzer IVs, straight from the factory. The German force, part of the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, who had taken command only 8 days before the offensive, fielded over 260 tanks and assault guns. Roughly 107 of them were Panthers. Roughly 75 were Panzer IVs. The American defending force was smaller. The German tanks were, as machines, technically superior. What followed was a battle the German planners had not at all expected. On the morning of the 19th of September, heavy fog blanketed the Lorraine countryside. The Germans had assumed they would use their longer-ranged guns to engage Shermans at distances where the American 75mm could not reply effectively. The fog erased that advantage. The two new German panzer brigades had received their tanks so recently that their crews had barely trained together. They had no integral reconnaissance units. They advanced into the fog blind. American Shermans of the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would much later in his career become Army Chief of Staff, used the fog as cover to maneuver against the German formations from the flanks. C Company, under Captain Richard Lamison, set up on a ridge near Bézange-la-Petite, ambushed a group of 8 Panthers, knocked out 4 before the Germans could return fire, withdrew over the crest, repositioned, and finished off the remaining 4. The fighting continued for 11 days. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 405th Fighter Group entered the engagement when the fog lifted, attacking German armour in the open. By the end of the battle, the Germans had lost approximately 200 armoured vehicles. Of the 262 they had started with, only 62 were operational at the close of fighting. American Combat Command A, which bore the brunt of the fight, lost roughly 14 Shermans and 7 light tanks in the peak engagements of the 19th through 22nd of September, with total American armoured losses across the 11-day battle, reaching about 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers totally destroyed. But the loss numbers, stark as they are not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is what happened to the tanks that the Americans did lose. Many of them were repaired and brought back. The 4th Armoured Division's Maintenance Battalion, working at vehicle collecting points just behind the line, recovered Shermans that had been hit but not burned out. They patched armour, replaced track, swapped engines. By the time the battle ended, the operational fighting strength of the American formation was, in some companies, very nearly what it had been when the battle started, despite the casualties suffered. The German formation, even though it had inflicted heavy losses on the Americans, simply melted away. There was no comparable system on the German side to bring its damaged tanks back. There were not enough Berger Panthers, the recovery vehicles built on the Panther chassis. There were not enough mechanics. There was not enough fuel even to drive damaged tanks to a depot. The fog and the air superiority of the 19th Tactical Air Command, with its P-47 Thunderbolts, made German recovery operations during daylight nearly impossible. The 2 new German panzer brigades thrown into the battle ceased to exist as effective formations. By contrast, the 4th Armoured Division kept fighting in the Lorraine through October. It was Mellenthin's Army Group G that bore the consequences. Within days of Arracourt, his staff was tracking American formations they had reduced below combat strength only to find them at near full strength again because, in the meantime, the American maintenance battalions had returned 6 or 8 knocked-out Shermans to the line. In panzer battles, Mellenthin would later treat the experience with the careful detachment of a professional whose army had been outlasted by what he plainly recognized as a more sustainable system. And here is the cruelest part of the inversion. The German army did not lack the engineering capability to build a recovery system as good as the American one. What it lacked was the industrial base, the trained civilian manpower, and increasingly, by 1944, the simple time and fuel to run such a system at the scale the war demanded. The Eastern Front had eaten the trained mechanics. The bombing campaigns had eaten the spare parts factories. The fuel shortages of late 1944 had eaten the recovery vehicle operations. By the time the Wehrmacht needed a Sherman-style maintenance system most desperately, it could no longer build one. The Americans, who had never quite intended to build the system either, but had stumbled into it through the cumulative weight of 40 years of automobile culture, were watching it pay off in real time. By December of 1944, the disparity was producing moments that no German staff officer could rationalize. During the Ardennes offensive, the German breakthrough in the Belgian forests on the 16th of December, the Wehrmacht punched a deep salient into the American lines and advanced nearly to the Meuse River. But within 2 weeks, the attack had stalled. There were many reasons. American resistance at Bastogne and St. Vith, Patton's pivot of the Third Army, weather clearing in time for the 9th Air Force to begin strikes again, but underlying all of it was a logistical truth. American armored units in the offensive's path were taking casualties and replacing them. German armored units were taking casualties and bleeding out. The gap widened by the day. The 740th Tank Battalion, which had been training in secret on a special carbon arc searchlight tank concept called the Canal Defense Light at Camp Baus in the Arizona desert, had been reconfigured as a standard medium tank battalion when its CDL mission was cancelled. When the German offensive broke through near Stoumont in Belgium on the 19th of December, the 740th had only 9 Shermans, a few light tanks, and whatever else its men could scavenge from the 1st Army Ordnance Depot at Sprymont. With that mismatched collection of vehicles, the battalion stopped Kampfgruppe Piper's drive at Stoumont Station. The battalion fought ferociously, lost vehicles, received replacements pulled from rebuilt stocks, and held the road. The American maintenance system did not break. The German one did. If your father or grandfather served in an American armored division, in any theater, and you have inherited stories or photographs about the work of recovery, repair, or maintenance, I would consider it an honor to read what you remember in the comments. What unit, where they served, what they fixed. The records of the official ordnance battalions are thin and often impersonal. The actual memory of that work lives, where it lives at all, with the families of the men who did it. That memory deserves to be preserved. In May of 1945, after the German surrender, the United States Army's Historical Division began the program that produced the manuscript Mellenthin and his colleagues would eventually contribute to. It was called the Foreign Military Studies Program. Captured senior German officers, generals, Panzer Corps commanders, and senior staff officers were brought to facilities at Allendorf, Neustadt, and the Bad Mondorf Interrogation Center in Luxembourg. There, working with American interpreters and historians, they were asked to write narrative accounts of what they had done in the war and what they had observed. The early interviews, conducted in the summer and autumn of 1945, went under the name European Theatre Historical Interrogations, abbreviated ETHINT. Some 80 interviews were conducted with high-ranking German officers in this initial phase. The program then expanded into the A series of transcribed oral interviews, the B series of unit narratives on the Western Front, the C series of source material studies for the official American history of the war, and the D series covering the Mediterranean and the East. The studies are sometimes self-serving. They are sometimes evasive on questions of war crimes. But on questions of pure military comparison, the German generals were often startlingly direct. They had nothing to gain by lying to themselves at that point. They were prisoners. They were writing for posterity. Some of them were writing in the hope that their analysis would help shape the post-war Western alliance against the Soviet Union, which several of them clearly anticipated. What is striking, when you read the relevant studies on armored warfare, is what the German generals kept circling back to. They did not, on the whole, blame American tank design. They were quite frank that the Sherman was a less capable individual machine than the Panther. They did not blame American crews, who they generally rated as competent but not exceptional. What they blamed, again and again, was the depth. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, who had commanded Panzer Group West in Normandy until being relieved in early July of 1944, contributed an ETHINT manuscript called Panzer Tactics in Normandy in December of 1947. In it he observed that American armored formations seemed to have a recuperative capacity that German formations did not. Tanks that were destroyed in his sector reappeared in numbers his intelligence sections could not account for. He attributed this not to American replacement production, which he understood was very high, but to something more granular, the ability of small American units to keep their own equipment alive in ways German units could not. Mellenthin, in Panzer Battles, made the broader argument that ran through much of the foreign military studies output. The German army, by 1944, was being defeated not so much by the American soldier, whom German generals respected but did not consider a superior fighting man, and not by American tank design, which they openly considered inferior, but by the depth of American material and logistical organization. German divisions in 1944 were fighting from a steadily shrinking base. American divisions were fighting from a base that kept replenishing itself faster than combat could deplete it. The war, in his view, had stopped being a contest between armies and become a contest between systems. That observation, repeated across many of the manuscripts, gets at the central point. The Americans had built an army that, in a peculiar and almost biological sense, healed. Tanks that were knocked out came back. Units that were degraded recovered. Formations that should have been combat ineffective regained their fighting strength faster than German intelligence could track. The German military vocabulary, built on the language of order of battle and unit strength and replacement, did not naturally accommodate this. The Germans had categories for replacement, where new equipment arrived from the rear. They had categories for reinforcement, where additional units were added to a formation. They did not have a clean category for what the American system was doing, which was something closer to repair on an industrial scale, applied continuously and right behind the front line. This is the closest the Germans ever got, in the documentary record, to articulating what they had been watching during the war itself. It was the most ordinary and yet most consequential American military innovation of the war. The thing the Germans never matched. The reason the Sherman, an inferior machine, beat the Panther, a superior one. So here is the answer to the question that ran through Mellenthin's Lorraine farmhouse staff meetings in late September of 1944. Where are these tanks coming from? We killed them. They came back. The tanks were coming from the same place they had been the day before. They were the same tanks. Some of them, exactly the same, with their hull numbers intact, and the same crews who had bailed out 48 hours earlier now back in their seats. Some of them rebuilt overnight from a parts inventory in a vehicle collecting point 10 miles to the rear. Some of them dragged out of the mud by an M32 recovery vehicle whose driver had been a service station mechanic in Akron in 1939 and whose welder had been a body shop man in Pittsburgh. The Germans could not see this clearly because their doctrinal vocabulary did not have a category for it. They could imagine an enemy with more tanks. They could imagine an enemy with better tanks. They could not quite imagine an enemy whose ordinary, unremarkable, mass-produced tanks simply refused to stay dead. That was not a question of armor. It was not a question of guns. It was a question of an entire civilian society that had spent 40 years learning how to keep machines running, and that had quietly, by accident, brought that habit into uniform. The honest verdict on the Sherman tank in the Second World War, the one that has gradually emerged as the post-war romance about the unbeatable Panther has faded, is that the Sherman was not an individually superior tank. The German tankers were not wrong about that. The Panther's frontal armor really was nearly invulnerable to a Sherman 75 at combat range. The Panther's gun really could destroy a Sherman at well over 1,000 yards. The Panther crew that knew its business and got the first shot really could, and often did, kill multiple Shermans in a single engagement. The Sherman won anyway, because the Sherman was not a tank. The Sherman was a system. The system was a tank, plus a maintenance battalion, plus a recovery vehicle, plus a vehicle collecting point, plus a deeper depot, plus a rebuild facility, plus a national supply chain reaching all the way back to Detroit, and to the foundries of Pittsburgh and to the General Motors plants in Michigan. Each Sherman the Germans engaged was the visible tip of an enormous, mostly invisible support pyramid. When they killed the tip, the pyramid produced another one. They could not see the pyramid because the pyramid was 40 years old and had nothing to do with the war. It was American civilian industry. It was American motor culture. It was already there before the war started. The men in this story are real, and most of them are not in the standard accounts. Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin was real, served as Chief of Staff of Army Group G in Lorraine in September of 1944, witnessed the consequences of Arracourt firsthand, and recorded his observations in Panzer battles. Belton Cooper was real, and his work as an ordnance liaison officer in the 3rd Armoured Division is documented in his memoir and in divisional records. The numbers from the 3rd Armoured Division, 232 tanks at the start, 648 destroyed, 700 recovered and returned, are Cooper's own figures, drawn from the Divisional After-Action Archive at the University of Illinois, and while historians like Stephen Zaloga have argued they overstate the loss rate by combining damage categories, The broad shape of the picture they describe is solidly attested. The M32 recovery vehicle was real and is preserved today in armour museums around the world. The 33rd Maintenance Battalion's vehicle collecting point near Arles was real, and the work performed there in June and July of 1944 is described in detail in Cooper's account and in the Warfare History Network's reconstructions. Curtis Cullen was real, and his Rhino device cut the Normandy bocage in July of 1944. Lafayette Poole was real, and his tanks named In the Mood are commemorated today in Mons. The Battle of Arracourt was real, and the disparity in losses and recoverable casualties is documented in Hugh Cole's Lorraine campaign, the official United States Army history. Captain Richard Lamesson's ambush at Bézange-la-Petite is described in the same source. William Knudsen was real, and his decision to bring Detroit's mass production methods to American war industry is one of the most consequential individual contributions any civilian made to the Allied war effort. The Foreign Military Studies program was real, and the German generals who wrote in it really did keep returning to the question of why American tanks would not stay knocked out. What they reached for, in those studies, was a vocabulary their own military culture had never quite developed. The German army of the 19th and 20th centuries had been built on the idea that war was a clash of armies as instruments of national will. A tank was a weapon, a soldier was a tool, a battle was a trial of which side could break the other first. The American way of war, when it finally arrived at scale in 1944, did not deny any of that. It just added something the Germans had not seen before. It added the assumption that everything that broke could be fixed, that every tank that died could be brought back, that every soldier and every machine was part of a larger system that healed itself faster than it could be wounded. When Mellenthin sat in that Lorraine farmhouse and tried to explain to his staff why the American formation across the field would not stay degraded, the answer he could not have put cleanly into German doctrinal language was that the tanks across the field were coming from a country that had spent the first 40 years of the 20th century learning, in millions of garages and barns and service stations, how to keep metal alive. The tank in front of him, with its unfamiliar weld marks and its crew already back at the controls, was the product of a civilian habit of mind that no doctrine could have produced. It was the result of a people who, long before they ever put on a uniform, had learned not to throw broken things away. If this investigation gave you something to think about, please give the video a like. It helps the analysis reach the viewers who care about getting the history straight. Not the romantic version, where the German tanks were unbeatable and the Americans won by sheer numbers, and not the dismissive version, where the Sherman was a death trap and its crews were sent into hopeless fights. The real story is more interesting and more honest than either. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories, about the men who fought, and about the men in the wrenches who kept their machines running, and about the long, slow accumulation of ordinary civilian skill that made the difference when it finally counted. The Germans built better individual tanks. The Americans built a country that knew how to fix them. 80 years later, the roads of Lorraine are paved over, and the wreckage is gone. But the answer to the question Mellenthin and his staff officers were turning over in late September of 1944 is the one the Wehrmacht never fully accepted, which is that nothing made of metal, properly attended to by men who know what they are doing, ever has to stay broken for long.